Games discourse is a field populated with a lot of people thinking very hard about principles they've mainly heard of from other games discourses. It's okay to do this, after all, we all learn from one another, but it does result in a kinda backwardsy approach to academic terminology, where there are people who use, for example, ludonarrative dissonance and don't realize that it has a background and a history as a term, and other academic sources from which it grew. When media studies people, the people who talk about these things, do so, we do it with an understanding that we're not proving definitive information, usually. We're discussing a set of tools we learn that help us coalesce meaning for things together. Understand, as I explain these things, I do not want to present this as the one true way to see things. This is a tool that will let you integrate these ideas into existing, useful ways to academically examine games. With that in mind, let's talk about text. Specifically, let's talk about paratext. Sometimes when people talk about what's in a game, you'll hear the idea of text and subtext, which are usually terms we borrow from typically cinema people, who themselves borrow the term from literary analysis people. Text is kind of simple. Text is the work. Text is the stuff put into the work to be experienced. So, in a movie, the stuff that got put to the film so that you could watch it, that's the movie's text. In a book's case, it's the actual words, but not the page. You can put the words in a different blank book, and the text itself won't change. What gets left aside in these forms, understandably so, is paratext. Normally, paratext is pretty discardable for these kinds of analysis, but games are different. Paratext is a term from Gerard Geanette in his book Paratexts, Thresholds of Interpretation, to describe the influence of non-text components of a text experience. His interests were things like book covers, paper texture, book weight, binding, cover art, and book jackets. In Paratexts, he describes paratext as a zone between text and off-text, a zone not only of transition, but also of transaction, a privileged place of pragmatics and a strategy, of an influence on the public, an influence that is at the service of a better reception for the text and a more pertinent reading of it. I was tempted to do a French accent there, but no. This idea opened up the conversation to the fact that not everything that influences a text is in the text. Each text has a context. As Geanette spoke of the components of a book that were not the words on a page, there are other components of other texts. How many people do you think have their perspectives on movies changed because of associations with bad dates? How many game reviews are tainted by the short window of time in which to play them? How many essays are marked as if they're essay 45 in a stack of 50? When you go see a Transformers movie, how much are you let down that the advertising was really different to what you actually saw? Paratext, in this case, refers to media created as a requirement to experience the text. What you use to experience a text is part of it. It's not text, it's not required to be part of it, but it is an influence, it's a component. It's one of these thresholds, as Geanette called them. If you don't have a player, a game still has pieces. It still has words and it still has rulebooks, and you can look at and examine those things. But you don't get the play that games are for. In order to see that, in order to experience that, you need a player. That makes the player part of this paratext. In this model, you can look at games as a text, which is mostly inert, and can only be considered as how it might be seen by a player. And you could do textual analysis of that stuff, but the game as played is paratext. For some games, this means that the story that the player creates is another text, and the player is part of it. What does that get us, if we accept this tool and use it? 3 basic points. First, play is creative. You're given a toolbox and a space in which to create your experience. But you determine how that experience goes. You get to try things out, you get to explore them, and you can do well or you can do poorly, and you make choices about what you'll do to overcome the obstacles. Even entirely linear games give you the choice of whether or not you continue to engage with the game. Second, the player is part of the experience. We all know this is the case, but there's some sort of tacit effort to pretend it's not true. Editorial oversight on a number of game sites tries to remove the presence of the journalist, tries to pretend that the individual experience of the game doesn't exist, and is instead some sort of impartial, perfect expression of an objective reality. This is, in part, why we get so many crybabies whining about the importance of Puerto Rico, or blindingly oblivious white guys finding the racial complexities of Bioshock Infinite thought-provoking. The best critics are the ones willing to put themselves in the context and let the viewer recognize them as components of the work, and those who are willing to remember that other players face games differently. Third, it gives us a level space to do textual analysis on the things the player doesn't muck around with. Cutscenes, for example, are things that the player doesn't change, but become part of the player's paratext of play. We can look at Bioshock Infinite's text and consider it, and at the same time, we can observe the individual experiences of a player, and they can relate to that story. Of course, for many video games, strict textual analysis is going to have a little to work with, but it won't have to address the problems of trying to discuss what players should or are expected to do without acknowledging that players themselves are creative influences on the work. A textual analysis of a game in this context will be able to recognize that you are bringing together components of the game and examining the text that you have brought together.